Hello, I'm Professor Matthew Rotella, and in this tutorial I'm going to be going over setting up render passes. I'm, as you can see, going to be using Arnold, but the process is much the same for a lot of other renderers, no matter what you're using. But I'm going to be going over what render passes are in the first place, how to set them up, and then how you can use them to composite in Photoshop or some other such program. It's easier working with these things in Nuke or programs with that, or at least it is for me when I'm compositing and working with my animations. But I'm going to be just working in Photoshop today, mainly because more people are familiar with Photoshop and using it in that way. But basically, what render passes are is, which I'll go over this first before I go over setting up your render passes, mainly because setting them up is extraordinarily easy, especially with the Arnold setup that we have here. So that when it comes down to that part, it will really only take a hot second. But what they are is it's basically your render split up into its individual components. So I got a pretty simple setup here, just a mug on a table, and generally your final image that's referred to as your Muti-Pass. Your full image with all of its components in it, but in your render settings you can put out all of these AOVs or render passes. The terms are used interchangeably. You can see just your diffuse pass, for example, just your specular pass, and then you can go even further to see just your direct diffuse versus your indirect diffuse. So your indirect diffuse, of course, being the color that your objects inherit from other things around it. So in this case, like, you get a little extra brightness on the wood near where the mug is, because light is bouncing off the mug and hitting the table, and you get that sort of warm brown color reflecting onto the mug from it hitting the wood. And to this extent, you can also troubleshoot where you need to up your samples if you are experiencing a lot of noise in your renders. Like, you can see that I don't really have a lot of noise in my direct diffuse. It looks rather smooth, but then if I look in my indirect diffuse, I have all this noise that I'm getting. Therefore, to get rid of that noise, I'm going to need to up my diffuse samples. Now, upping your light samples can help you resolve some of that noise a little bit, but not usually in your indirect passes. Usually, upping your light samples will help with eliminate noise from your direct hit on that attribute, but not your indirect. Same thing with specular. I can get just my direct specular hits, which, I don't have a ton going on there, but then my indirect specular is going to have all of my reflections and such there. And similarly, you can see that I don't have any of that noise in my direct specular, but I have it in my indirect specular. So I can see that I may want to end up upping my specular samples if I want a more high fidelity render until I'm satisfied with the elimination of noise. I'll get into these shadow passes later, and there's also things like the diffuse albedo pass if you want just a straight readout of the colors that your objects should have, basically sans shading. And there's also things like both of these objects have clear coats. The wood because it's finished wood, the mug because it's because it has that glazing on top of it, so I have a clear coat on both the shaders. And then there's also very useful utilities such as this, your ID pass, which I'll go over setting up the ID pass for the mug. Because you can see I have just an ID on the table at the moment, and the process is pretty easy. Anyway, let's get into setting up all these different passes, which are very useful because they allow you to control entire attributes individually, which if you're working with long sequences and you are compositing in a layered way in a program like Nuke, then you essentially never have to re-render your sequence again unless you have like major you basically never have to re-render your sequence again as long as you have the right render passes and as long as there aren't any like major changes to camera angles or edits. But in any case, let's go over how to set these up, and it's pretty much drag and drop. I'm going to turn on progressive refinement because I'm going to end up re-rendering some of this, and it's not the fastest on the computer that I'm working on. But regardless, if you go into your render settings, which is either here, this little clapboard with the gear, or you can go up to Windows, Rendering Editors, Render Settings, whatever makes you happy. Of course, I usually just go for the shortcut, but you can look at all your various attributes, and you'll see that there is, in fact, an AOVs tab. Now, I have all of these turned on at the moment, but I'll just get rid of all of them, and you can see that the process of adding them is really straightforward. It's just looking through the browser, selecting the AOV that you want, and then telling it to go over into the active AOVs list, hitting the arrows button. So basically, for anything you render, you'll likely want the main pass for whatever your main attributes are. You're basically always going to want a diffuse and a specular pass, and then basically you can take it from there. I like to always have an object ID pass as well, so I have a useful utility for easily creating masks and mats to edit objects individually, and it's always handy. So, yeah, basically, but yeah, you basically always want your diffuse and your specular pass at the very least. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I have that ID pass. So I'll go over making the ID pass right now, which in Arnold happens, if you're going for the easiest way of creating it, it happens at the, it's going about it just applying it to singular shaders. So I got AI Mug right here, which is in Arnold Standard Surface Shader, which, as you can rightfully assume, is for the mug. And then here, there's AOVs. Now, I already have red applied to the table, or the standard surface shader that's for the table, so I'll use either G or B for putting my mug into that. For this to be able to, for these ID passes, or some people even call them disco mats because of how like vibrant the colors are, I would recommend sticking to your standard 3 channels for the colors that you assign, R, G, or B, because that way you can always easily isolate those channels and therefore isolate those mats in various programs that you're using. But in any case, you just got to give it a name. So ID1, pretty straightforward. And then I'll give it either G or B. I'll make it blue. So ID1, and now it's blue. Alright, now, if I were to hit File, or Render, rather, refresh Render, and I'll just hit Abort. If I were to look at my render passes, you can see it's not there yet. Well, I didn't assign it to the list yet. So, what I want to do, and you'll likely see that ID1, there is ID pass, which is something different, but I do not have ID1 in the list. Well, I have to hit Add Custom. What's my AOV name? it's ID1. And then if I hit create, it'll plop it in the list. And now if I were to hit refresh render and have it start cooking again, and then if I were to start looking at my list, you can see I have ID1 in the list. And my mug is blue, and my table is red, giving me a mat that I can easily use. So, yeah, generally, these are the passes that I like to stick with as like a baseline level. There are lots of other render passes that have lots of utilitarian purposes. But I'm going to make a bunch of other passes. Well, I have a clear coat, so I'm going to want to have a coat pass. I have diffuse albedo could be useful for something. I definitely want to have, then I'm going to add my direct and indirect diffuse, so I can have individual control over that. And again, if you had objects with subsurface scattering, or you had objects with transmission, those passes are useful to include. I do not have those attributes on these shaders, so therefore they would be useless and just render black. But lastly, I want the specular, direct, and indirect. Okay, and this is really all the passes I need to get a good handle on things here. So now if I were to, now as far as getting these passes out of Maya, which perhaps I'll lower my resolution for this because these renders were taking not a long time, but a lot longer than I particularly want to wait. So I'll turn it all the way down to HD 540. But regardless, let's see here. And now as far as getting them out of Maya, which I actually have some previous passes that I could use instead, but regardless, you can check save final images so that when you render it and if I were to go into my images folder, and then if I look in my temp folder, it has generated folders for all of the render passes that I'm using. Now, some of these are leftover folders from when I was rendering for different scenes, but I got, you can see which ones are filling up with files, which are the ones that I have ID passes for this render. Okay, and we're just about finished here. And that's that. Okay, so now I'll go into Photoshop and well, actually I'll just should open by default in Photoshop, and the layer that I want to use at the bottom is going to be my diffuse layer, because and I want it at the bottom because this is the way that Arnold shaders layer their surfaces. And let's say I'll use it as the alpha channel, which if you look at the Arnold standard surface shader documentation, you can see that. Anyway, let's get a new layer, and then so you can see we have just our diffuse, both our direct and indirect diffuse in the same layer. And now if I wanted to layer things on top of it, so first of all we have our specular, which I could put it as just the specular, but I'll do direct first. say as transparency. And you can see it comes in as this first, but if I were to change it to linear dodge, which is just add, it'll add the pixel value on top of the pixel values from my diffuse pass, and therefore now I've added my direct specular hit, which of course if you're working like this, you're going to want to be naming your files. And also I'll make note that you can shuffle or you can combine all of these into one layered EXR in your render settings. If you go into your common and you hit merge AOVs, it'll save them all in one EXR image as different channels on your EXR, which if you're using something like Nuke can be shuffled out into different pipes to edit individually. But I think you can get a plugin for Photoshop, but I don't think Photoshop by default lets you do it for all the layers. At least that used to be the case. But regardless, this way works fine too, especially for individual images. Yeah, that's my specular direct. And then it's my specular, which probably should just have it as the alpha channel bringing in. That's my specular indirect, so now I have my reflections added into the shot, which I can turn on and off. And now, of course, we have our coat that will make up the rest of it, in which I just have this as one layer, as alpha channel. And there's the coat, linear dodge, add. And because of the way that Arnold conserves, it's a physically based render with conservation of energy. So as you add up all of these layers onto each other, as long as you don't add too many layers in, it should always, it should never start blowing out or exceeding your values. But yeah, with this, that's my diffuse, my specular, and my coat, which makes up all the layers of the surface shaders that I had built. So now I essentially have my beauty render again, which I can just do a quick swap back to Arnold and see that that is in fact the case. I have all of these details present in my Photoshop render. Okay, so now, again, how is this useful? Well, this gives us individual control over each aspect of what we rendered. So, for example, let's say we wanted to turn our highlights blue. You can go into, or something like that. Go into our HSL key, and we can, that's not what I wanted. Actually, let's do it more in our, this is our indirect specular. Let's say we wanted more of a different color in our indirect specular. So if I go to my HSL, and here it's much more obvious where I can adjust the hue and the saturation, and you can see how just in my indirect specular I can add more of all sorts of colors. I can really go wild with it, or I can be subtle about it, making things, I can darken it, I can make it, oh, I don't want to make it layer. It's not the right way to go about doing that. But anyway, yeah, so I can add color to it, and I can use these passes to make masks, like clipping masks, to edit just certain things individually, so you don't get all of that big blowing out that I was getting earlier. Now let's say I want to make edits to my table here. So what I can do, which of course, yeah, what I can do is actually, so I can take my ID pass. There's my ID pass, which I want above my coat layer. Alright, but yeah, now that I have my ID layer in here, what I can do is I can look at individual channels and create clipping masks that I can use to edit different objects individually. And you can use these in conjunction with clipping masks that you can make by getting selections of your individual render passes as well. But for now, I'll just make some rather global changes. So I got my red channel here, which of course includes just my table because I have designed it to be so. And now I can get this selection of just my table and go back to my layers, go down, make a new layer, and then if I hit create vector mask with my selection in hand, it will make a clipping mask complete with what I have had selected. And now I can delete, or well, I could delete it, but I'll just hide that layer. And now I can do things like paint, like let's say for whatever reason, I want my table to have more of like more of a red hue, or maybe even I want it to be more cyan. Now I can go ahead and start painting, and you can see that it won't paint over my mug, and similarly it won't paint over my background. It stays contained to just my table, and then I'll just go ahead and hit multiply, and now my wood has been stained. So yeah, you can use all of these passes in conjunction to great effect to have just enormous control over your renders. Now, I know that this isn't generally what you're going to be going for with your renders, but I was just trying to make some rather clear and obscene changes to my objects for the sake of being obvious for the tutorial. But hopefully you can get the idea of how this gives you just each aspect of your render and makes it like completely tweakable to the point where you can like denoise in post. And I mean, if you got the right passes and you put them in the right program, you can even retexture and entirely relight your objects in post. Now that's a whole nother ball of wax, but regardless, you can do this thing. And so be aware. But that's basically it for render passes. I'm going to make another tutorial after this, which is going to be all about render layers. Now, just to recap, putting render passes on, pretty easy. It's just a matter of going through and just clicking them from one list to the other and having the correct passes that you want from your object. And then as far as building out your ID pass, it's pretty simple. You just go to whatever shader that you want to add in ID AOV2. So I had my mug shader, just scrolled down until I hit the AOV section, typed in ID1, made the color blue, and then went into my render settings and hit add custom, typed in ID1, which I could make another one where I say ID2, create, and bada bing, bada boom, it adds it to the list. And if you ever need more channels than just the RGB output, you can have it have an RGB, if it supports it, yeah, it can have RGBA output. But let's say you got that alpha channel from your various render passes. So just be aware with what you can do, and just how powerful all of these things are. Which, just get rid of ID2. Yeah, which if you ever need to get rid of render passes, of course you don't have to hit delete all. You can just bing, bang, and now I just have that direct specular output. Okay, so yeah, that's about it. I hope this was helpful. Hope you learned. Hope you understand how powerful render passes can be. Like I said, they can save you from ever re-rendering again, which is a godsend. So, be aware. And thanks for watching.